Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of Halftime Talk. We're delighted to be joined by Karen Young, Senior Fellow and Founding Director of the Program on Economics and Energy at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you for having me.
Karen, let's kick off with you're in Washington, we're here in the Gulf. Or at least I am, and the sort of narrative that has been building over certainly has become a lot more pronounced during the crisis of the Ukraine war, and that is the apparent split between Washington and Riyadh, Washington and Abu Dhabi. Famously, the Wall Street Journal had an article headline in the recent weeks that Biden's phone calls weren't being answered. Generally, I would welcome your insights. Is this a overblown divorce, separation, tiff? What's your thoughts on how serious is the current breakdown in relations between Washington and their traditional allies in the Gulf?
Well, thanks, Sean. Yeah, I think, some of the stories, especially in the Journal, have been a little bit, overwrought, right? They're really, trying to create this sense of drama, which is their job. There certainly is tension. And, this is, I think, was going to be difficult for the Biden administration, no matter what, but certainly with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's gotten much worse. And I think this builds upon, a sense within US domestic politics, a bit of confusion of what energy independence was supposed to mean, about what, our kind of pivot away from the Middle East was supposed to mean. And the reality check is, the US still does need strong partnerships in the region with energy suppliers, that we're in this together. And so some of it has to do with the sort of momentum in our domestic dialogue, which has been, very, very much anti-oil and gas and anti-Saudi and Emirati to a degree. And then the reality of what we actually do need each other for. So, I think that's where we are. It's going to be difficult no matter what. And now, because we are in a very serious, I think, energy crisis, and we all know now a bit more clearly what our energy security should mean, the stakes are higher.
There was obviously at this moment with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this energy crisis intersects with this conflict. And of course, one of the intersection points is the fact that Russia is part of OPEC Plus. I always thought it was a little bit strange 5-6 years ago when OPEC Plus was first born, that Russia had really an open door to join and go into the kitchen of OPEC Plus. It didn't seem Washington had any issue with it. Was that a bit naive at the time, or how do you see the legacy of this relationship?
Well, I think many of our perceptions of Russian engagement, ask the Germans, have been certainly naive. And so we're learning that the hard way. But it's interesting to think about why the Gulf states now have been, I think, very open to the idea of maintaining very close ties with Putin and with Russia in general. And you have to think about why that is, because it's not about Russia's capacity as a source of foreign direct investment. It's not really even about security ties. Russia supplies some, sort of weapon systems to the region, but not really in competition or what you would want to have to, forego a relationship with the United States. So what is it that creates this affinity? And so OPEC Plus is certainly part of that. So since the end of 2016, in the sense that Russia is such an important producer on energy markets, and that you want to have obviously some coordination there. And also that lesson was learned in March of 2020. And so it's not that OPEC Plus is ironclad. There have been disagreements, right, within it, but it's seen as better than having no coordination. But the affinity with Putin, I think, really, it's not about a lot more than the oil, and a personal relationship with Putin, in that the leadership within the Gulf has a certain understanding among authoritarian leaders, and Putin is seen as being good on his word, right?
Why is it, do you think, that Putin and to a certain extent his counterpart Xi in China can seem to both enjoy both sides of the bed, so to speak. They're allowed to go to Tehran and do all of the deals they like. I mean, Tehran, Syria, and Russia together in Syria, and yet, and the Gulf states don't seem to have too much an issue with those sort of contradictions, if you like, and yet the US and to a certain extent Europe, it can only stay on one side of the bed, and if they make any attempt to do otherwise, they get somewhat oscillated as they are at the moment.
Yeah. Well, I think it's this authoritarian bargain. It's this sense that you make an agreement, the Russians and the Chinese, they don't really overpromise. You know what you're going to get, and it's clear. And so it's a negotiation. And I think the broader context, frankly, I mean, there's a lot of talk about this hedging that the Gulf states are doing between the East and West. And I think it's quite beyond that, actually. I mean, that's one way to put it. But another way to understand it is that the UAE and I think Saudi Arabia to a degree have made an assessment, a strategic assessment, that the global economy in the future is one that will be bifurcated. And there will be a certain amount of power and amount of capital that's amassed in the hands of authoritarian capitalists. And then there will be the rules and the capital flows of the West. And they do want to sit in between that. And that's getting
Will there be consequences, do you think? I mean,
absolutely.
We're seeing that this current sort of sanctions regime, if you like, that we've seen so far in Russia is not extraterritorial in the way that the Iran was. There's optional to comply if you would like to. In the sense, there doesn't seem to be consequences for India or for other friends of the West, of the US, from not sort of siding with them in this standoff.
I think that's about to change. So when more of the European sanctions are enforceable by May 15th, and if we do see a more stringent embargo of Russian oil, the market's going to change fundamentally, right? And make it much more difficult for this product to get to customers. And then you're going to see, I think, some tension within OPEC Plus. And I think also, in some ways, those producers with spare capacity, the Saudis, the Kuwaitis, the Emiratis, are going to have an opportunity, right? They're going to have an opportunity to try to get into that market share that Russia produced. But I think the fundamental message, which I have been, trying to say in Washington, is that even so, the Saudis and the Emiratis, they can't fix this, right? They can't magically find 6.5 million barrels a day if Russian oil is off market. So there's a bit of that sort of sitting in the middle of the expectations on the US side, I think, are way too high. And then maybe the understanding on the Eastern side, whether it's the consumers in China or whether producers in Russia, are maybe not factoring in just how difficult this could become.
Of course, this sort of fractured friendship, if you like, long predates Ukraine, and obviously there's a variety of components to it, and language used by the president during his election campaign and so forth. But even during the previous administration, Obama, the red line in Syria, the general idea that the US is a retreating posture from the region, and hence some sort of vacuum left in its wake. Is that a false narrative? Is it true? How big of a factor is that at this point, do you think?
I think it's a bit of a glossing over, which is the simple fact that US domestic politics have changed a lot in the last two administrations. We are a more divided polity. We're going through, a bit of a crisis of our own. And so that's really hard for our partners and allies to navigate. And not just for, those relationships that are in tough places. It's also been hard for the Europeans, right? So this moment in the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been a sense of, oh, we're back on track with that NATO partnership. That, the NATO relationship was not very good in the Trump administration. So it manifests in, I think, many, many ways. But I think the root cause is frankly, divisions within US domestic politics, and the way that we talk about foreign policy and the way that decision-making happens in the US. That's really changed in the last 15 years or so.
Does the relationship with the Gulf get sucked into that sort of breakdown in American politics?
The Biden administration comes in with this this theory of a foreign policy of the middle class. Well, what does that mean? Foreign policy traditionally in the US has always been very much sort of elite level decision making, and not really mixed in so much beyond the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And that has completely changed. So, our relationships with the Gulf are now more identified by party. Gulf partners are more comfortable with Republicans now. We didn't really have that issue.
It's the same with Israel in a way. That's fallen into the same category.
That's right. Yes, that's true.
And where does that all intersect with the war in Yemen, which of course is one of the key kind of immediate issues for the Gulf states, that the Houthis have this now capability of, although we're in a ceasefire at the moment and long may it last, but ultimately the capacity of the Houthi forces in Yemen to throw missiles into Saudi and now including the UAE this year, and the perception that the US is not doing their role as a protector.
Yeah, and that is a giant sense of frustration on the part of the UAE now after they were attacked, and certainly long-standing one of the Saudis. And again, in US domestic politics, the Yemen war is very, very unpopular, but we also weren't very truthful domestically about our engagement and our involvement in that war. And so there is a movement, very much called the restraint movement within US domestic politics, that wants to see less US boots on the ground, particularly in the Middle East. But this sense that, if you have a partnership and you have been in the fight together, and, let's remember, there was a UN security resolution on the war in Yemen. This was a war that was legal. And the US was actively engaged on the side of the Saudis in intelligence sharing and targeting. And so, the sense that, we were involved in something illegal and wrong is not really true. But the frustration and the way that, of course, much of the targeting that the Saudis in particular did, and some of the human rights abuses that were attributed to the Emirati forces, the US, general public and the Congress just wants nothing to do with it. And so you abruptly sort of disengage, but the problem didn't go away, right? The threat is still there. And so the frustration is that it's actually gotten worse. Like, what was a very limited Iranian role in the Yemen war in late 2015 is now quite blatant. And the Iranians have gotten, I think, a lot of mileage out of very little investment in that war. And so it's not going to go away, and that threat will only be, I think, amplified in the food insecurity that we face now and the inflationary pressure that we face now. A country like Yemen, 30 million people on the border in the peninsula, and this will be a long-term vulnerability to the Saudis, to the Omanis, as well as the Emiratis.
Touching there on the Iran question, would be remiss not to take a quick moment to analyze whether the Iran nuclear talks in Vienna are now moving into the dying stages, or are we just not seeing the light because everybody is too far away or we're not invited in the room? Is this still a viable project?
Well, I mean, I don't have information of what's going on in that room, but my personal sense is that it's not a very tenable project, particularly if what the Iranian government seems to be asking for, which is the removal of the terrorist designation of the IRCG.
Is that a red line for Washington or for Tel Aviv or?
Well, it should be everybody's
Riyadh
line, in my opinion. But it's if the Biden administration is willing to make concessions there and sort of wiggle around, well, some of these people stay and some of these people are removed from the list, I think that really damages sort of US credibility. I mean, in this crisis, meaning the Iranian negotiations, along with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this administration, the Biden administration, has been willing to, I would say, move in ways that it said it wouldn't. This was supposed to be a human rights first agenda in foreign policy, and then all of a sudden they're willing to talk to Venezuela, right? Or they're really willing to accelerate the negotiations with Iran to get Iranian oil to market. I mean, that isn't really standing on principle. So I think it is a dangerous road to go down. I understand why the concern is there, but I think it would have been perhaps more fruitful to focus on the sources that were friendlier in the first place.
Is there a consequence of no deal? It seems I'm always confused by the regional position here that advocates in a very generic sense no deal, but ultimately no deal isn't a neutral posture. It's things happen, like they're, according to some fairly credible sources in Washington, only a few weeks away from the capability of creating a nuclear weapon in Iran. What's a no deal consequence here, do you think?
I think we're already there. I think it means nuclear proliferation in the region, and whether that starts as civilian use and in terms of building reactors for electricity production. But then I think the Pandora's box is opened, and I think that's the direction we're headed in. And certainly, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has been very, very clear in his assessment. If Iran has nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia will too, at any cost, right? And so, it seems that the interest is there, the need for and feeling of the need for self-defense. And so we get into a bit of an escalatory paradigm.
And you're sort of indicating you think that's inevitable now, that there's no nuclear deal with Iran, then inevitably that's the outcome.
I do think so, unfortunately.
That's pretty significant. In this sort of vacuum of US position or US absence from the Middle East, or certainly distracted from the Middle East, Karen, we've also had the recent obviously UAE relationship with Israel, Bahrain as well. But we also have the emergence of Qatar from isolation over the last few years, and now it has emerged from and back in the GCC fold. How do you see the GCC now as a unit? Does Qatar still stand with its own independence within the group? How do you see that?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm flying to Saudi Arabia on Friday on a Qatar Airways flight. I mean, 2 years ago, that was completely unthinkable, right?
Yes, exactly.
But yes. So the GCC is glued back together, but I don't think it is very cohesive or very strong as a bargaining unit, or certainly as a security cooperation unit. But there is a sense that there are bigger issues. There's also, this is a moment of tremendous windfall in terms of the revenue for oil and gas producers. And so when you have a neighbor like Qatar, who is really going to be doing well for the foreseeable future in terms of their LNG export, it's better to be friends. And so one of the things, I was in Doha a few weeks ago, and an interesting perception among sort of the state investment actors was that the Saudi story is a good one. We want to be part of that economic opportunity. And so you do hear language that I think is more conciliatory, much more realistic, and not holding a grudge, at least on the economic issues. So I think it's fascinating.
In that regard, obviously Qatar emerges in this window, given its LNG capacity from 77 million tons. They're in construction to go above 100 million tons a year. That's a major gas producer. I mean, that's on a scale similar to Saudi as an oil producer, especially given the importance now that LNG will be for Europe's future energy security. How important does that project Qatar, do you think, beyond where it has been a relatively small country in the Gulf?
Yeah, I mean, their positioning is certainly more important. They have this new kind of security relationship with the United States. which is very, very important to the Qataris, and now better relationships, frankly, in Europe. This agreement with the Germans to increase terminal capacity and kind of secure longer-term contracts of export to Europe. Those are all very, very big diplomatic as well as economic achievements for the LNG business. And yeah, I mean, it's like a 60% increase in terms of their capacity over the next 5 years. So they will be energy giants in the way.
And yet they shared that field with Iran, which
exactly.
If we go into this nuclear weapon escalation posture, all of these things become much more complicated.
It definitely becomes complicated, but all the more important that Qatar has secured that security cooperation and agreement with the United States. And that's always been, the kind of calculation that they've made, that they need to be in a close relationship with the United States. And so, yeah, I mean, it's what I think is more difficult for the Qataris is that they've also put themselves out as a kind of regional mediator. And, with the Taliban, that comes with some very unfortunate baggage. Things are going really well. They're facilitating the transfer of refugees. They're financially supporting the education of girls. And then the Taliban will, turn on you and flip. And so that's going to be, I think, a difficulty in their own kind of foreign ministry is maintaining those relationships and trying to keep some of those problem relationships in line. But they seem to be doing it rather well right now.
Yeah, it is a very unique position in a way, given that other piece, Taliban, Iran, Washington, they kind of have a unique, and especially when you consider it in context to our earlier conversation, that the old relationship, Riyadh and Washington, a little bit frustrated, Qatar may emerge. In terms of all things Ukraine, I know it's not Middle East ultimately, but it is the energy flow, the politics associated. Washington has said that they would not allow a nuclear Iran, which 1 and 1 is 2 from what you're saying, kind of puts Washington on course for a possible direct conflict with Iran. And similarly in Ukraine, reports over the weekend that Washington had an integral role in the intelligence provided in sinking the Russian ship in the Black Sea. My point is that Washington could be on track, your town, your leadership there, to be very directly involved in 2 hot conflicts. What is the politics of that in Washington, the stomach for that in Washington?
Well, you're exactly right. And I think this harkens back to what you mentioned before, Obama's red line in Syria. That was a lesson that I think was hard to learn, particularly among the Democrats, that you lose a lot of face when you don't keep to your promises. And so I think the Biden administration will be very careful to say what it's willing to tolerate. This already we've had a bit of waffling on, did the Russians use chemical weapons in Ukraine? The Biden administration doesn't really want to talk about that because it would force more of a confrontation. But going back to sort of our first point, which is, the strategic assessment within the Gulf is that there will be this bifurcation in our global economy and in global politics. And that is the direction that they see, and we all see our system heading. And so whether that's a confrontation with Russia, if it's China over Taiwan, if it's over an Iranian nuclear weapon, we've got very, very strong, kind of with us or against us moments. And that's
maybe the Saudis are making a calculation vis-a-vis Russia that they have influence on Iran, and if things go a certain direction, being still in the camp with Russia might be helpful.
Perhaps. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if that's complicated. That's a realistic assessment of what Russian capacity is on Iran right now.
Yeah. the the point ultimately that given all of these sort of intersecting points, I'd welcome some insight from you on, given you're obviously in Washington with your own expertise, what sort of political space or leeway does Biden have in these particular different avenues? I mean, in terms of Iran, does he have cover to be vague about Iran? Does he have a cover to continue to face off with Russia? An election year coming up. Are these things drawn into that? How much space does he have to act overseas in a more robust way than maybe presidents have at home?
Well, I think there's some room now. I mean, we're coming up to the midterm elections, this fall, and that everyone's expecting, really a big loss for Democrats.
Yeah.
And the way that, kind of inflationary pressure is going, gas prices are going, the Biden administration will be under pressure to make some conciliatory moves with other energy producers. So if that means backing down a bit on Russia, which I don't think is going to happen the embargoes of Russian oil are, I think, gaining momentum, but I don't know if we'll get 100% there. And the Biden administration might want to slow it down until December rather than November. But on the Iran deal, I think you could see it quietly fizzle out. I don't think it will make a lot of difference between now and November. I think,
of course, after November, which is the big gateway to the return of Donald Trump, which then sort of throws every color on everything, including Russia, including the Gulf and so forth. How big a factor does that become on the color of Washington and its actions and the Democrats and so forth, do you think? Given that we're all in agreement, the Democrats are going to lose badly, Trump reemerges as the real contender in 24.
Yeah, I mean, the Trump effect, the candidates that he's supporting, if they do very, very well this year, that creates a real dilemma for the Republican Party. And, of the faction within the Republican Party, the never Trumpers, the Mitt Romney and his sort of coalition.
His three friends.
Yeah, exactly. The very small coalition. And it's a mess. And so the division within, US domestic politics will probably get even nastier. And of course, if you've been following US politics, the big news is this leak of the draft Supreme Court decision making Roe v. Wade overturned. So that will animate people, and certainly push back on some of the Trump agenda, the conservatism of the Trump agenda. And so that could be, maybe, November's it hasn't happened yet. So maybe things could be a little bit better, but it looks like there's some big fights in our domestic politics.
Yeah, and that is really where my sense of where we sort of come to the end of our conversation. But there will be some calculations made, I suspect, in all of these different threads that the US is going to be swallowing itself over the next 2 years and aren't going to be in the capacity or appetite to take on foreign conflicts. That might be a calculation. It may be wrong. It may put us in a dangerous place, but it does seem to me that is going to be challenged on the international stage. And perhaps that might be an error to challenge America's appetite, but I think that is a risky moment, the 2 years after this midterm election. There's so much to talk about, Karen, but thank you so much for taking the time to be on Halftime Talk this week and really welcome your insights, and look forward to, hopefully, as you're on your regular trips to the region, that we might have a chance to catch up in person. But for now, thank you for being on Halftime Talk.
Thank you so much. And let's be optimistic. This could be a unifying moment in American politics. Collective or national defense becomes quite unifying. Let's see.
Yes, yeah, I know it is funny that way, and I suppose you're tasting a little bit of it at the moment vis-a-vis Ukraine, and everybody loves Mr. Zelensky, but it does start to feel a little bit, and I think this is the new narrative that will start to creep in, that America is driving Ukraine into a war it cannot win, and perhaps escalating things to a place that is problematic, the outcome of which could be very dangerous. But yes, we all need a North Star, and the absence of the US North Star in the world at the moment is not a comfortable place. At least that's my own personal point of view. I'd like to see it back shining brightly. Karen, thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.